My name is Catherine Miller, and the night my husband laughed softly in Japanese and said something he thought I couldn't understand, I felt my entire marriage crack open at the table of a quiet American restaurant. I remember the moment with painful clarity, the way his chopsticks paused midair, the slight lean toward his client, the confidence in his voice when he spoke words he believed were safely hidden from me. Words about money, about plans, about me. But that moment came later. That evening began like so many others in our life together, polite, orderly, and carefully surface level. Richard and I had been married for 22 years. A second marriage for both of us. At our age, romance looked different. It was shared routines, mutual respect, and an unspoken agreement not to stir old wounds. We lived in a comfortable suburb outside Columbus, Ohio. A brick house, trimmed hedges, neighbors who waved but never asked questions. Richard worked as a regional consultant, mostly domestic, but occasionally international. I had retired early from a logistics firm after years coordinating overseas shipments. During that time, I'd spent nearly 4 years working closely with Japanese partners. I'd learned the language well enough to negotiate contracts, share meals, and understand nuance. Richard knew I'd worked abroad. He never asked how deeply. That night, he told me we were meeting a Japanese client who was very traditional and suggested I might be bored. He said it lightly, with a smile. "You don't mind, do you?" he asked as he adjusted his tie. "Business talk." I smiled back. Of course not. The restaurant was a well-known Japanese place. Downtown, not flashy, just authentic. Paper lanterns, soft music, low voices. The kind of place where people assumed privacy. We were seated in a semi-private booth. The client arrived promptly, a man about Richard's age, polite and reserved. Introductions were made in English. Then gradually, Richard shifted into Japanese. I lowered my eyes, picked at my food, played the part he expected. As they talked, I listened. At first, it was harmless. Compliments. Polite negotiation. Then, the tone changed. Richard's voice grew casual. Familiar. Too relaxed. He joked about Americans being naive with money. He joked about wives who didn't need to know everything. I felt my fingers tighten around my teacup. Then he said it. A sentence spoken quickly, confidently, and quietly. A sentence about moving assets, about keeping things clean until after a deal was finalized, about how I wouldn't notice. I felt my chest go cold. I didn't look up. I didn't react. I didn't interrupt. I smiled, because in that moment, silence was the only power I had. On the drive home, Richard talked easily, about the deal, about how well it went. He asked if I enjoyed dinner. "It was lovely," I said. At home, I lay awake long after he fell asleep, listening to the rhythm of his breathing, replaying every word, every inflection. The next morning, nothing felt the same. I watched him pour his coffee, read the paper, kiss my cheek like he always did, and I realized something that frightened me more than anger ever could. This wasn't new behavior. This was just the first time I understood it. Over the next few days, memories surfaced differently. His insistence on handling all investments, his dismissive tone when I asked questions, the way he framed my trust as simplicity. "You don't like stress," he'd say. "Let me handle it." And I had let him. That week, I didn't confront him. I didn't accuse. I didn't cry. I gathered information. I logged into accounts I hadn't checked in years. I reviewed statements. I noticed transfers that hadn't been there before. Small enough to hide, consistent enough to matter. I realized he'd underestimated me. Not because he was cruel, but because he was comfortable. Comfort makes people careless. One afternoon, as I sorted through paperwork, Richard asked why I seemed distant. "Just tired," I said. He nodded, accepted it easily. That was the moment I understood the true shape of betrayal. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, assumptive, confident that I would never look closely. I did look, and I saw everything. The silence I carried after that dinner wasn't heavy at first. It was careful, measured, like placing fragile glass back on a shelf and pretending nothing had shifted. Richard noticed, of course. He always noticed changes in temperature tone timing, but he misread the reason. He thought I was distracted, tired, maybe bored. He had no idea I was listening more closely than I ever had in our 22 years of marriage. The morning after the dinner, I went through my usual routine. I made oatmeal. I fed the cat. I watered the fern by the kitchen window. Ordinary actions are a powerful disguise. They tell people everything is fine. Richard left for work, whistling. As soon as the door closed, I sat at the dining table with my laptop and a folder of old paperwork I'd nearly forgotten about. Retirement accounts, property tax statements, insurance documents. Things I'd once reviewed regularly, back when I was still working and sharp with numbers. Somewhere along the way, I had let him take over. Not because I was incapable, because I trusted him. I logged into our primary account first. Nothing unusual. Then, the secondary one Richard claimed was just for business expenses. It took longer to access. The password had been changed. That alone told me something. I didn't panic. I didn't call the bank. I wrote it down. That afternoon, I drove to the public library instead of going home. Old habits from my working years came back easily. Research, quiet observation, no digital trails. I learned more in 2 hours than I had in 2 decades. I learned how often financial manipulation happens in long marriages, especially when one spouse controls information. I learned how frequently older women assume trust means safety. And I learned that language, especially a language others assume you don't understand, can be used as a shield. That night, Richard mentioned the Japanese client again. He was impressed, Richard said, buttering his bread. "I think this deal could really set us up." For what I asked casually. "For the future," he replied. "Security." I nodded. "That's important." He smiled, relieved by my agreement. He didn't notice the way I watched his hands, the way he avoided my eyes when he spoke about numbers. Over the next week, I stayed quiet on purpose. I listened when he talked on the phone. I paid attention to when he stepped outside to take calls. I noted how often he referred to our finances when speaking to friends, but my accounts when speaking to colleagues. Language reveals ownership. One afternoon, while folding laundry, I remembered a phrase he'd used at the dinner one I hadn't reacted to at the time because I was too busy holding myself together. A phrase about wives who don't need the burden of details. I had translated it automatically then. Now, it rang differently. That evening, I opened a drawer in the study where Richard kept files. I didn't snoop wildly. I didn't rummage. I simply opened one folder at a time, like someone who belonged there. Because I did. There were documents I'd never seen, correspondence I wasn't copied on, notes about restructuring assets for flexibility. Flexibility for whom? I closed the drawer and went to bed before he noticed. In the days that followed, something unexpected happened. The more I learned, the calmer I became. Anger requires surprise. I no longer had any. What I felt instead was clarity. Richard wasn't planning to leave me. He wasn't having an affair. He wasn't reckless. He was strategic. And he assumed I was invisible in that strategy. That assumption was his mistake. I began making small changes. I asked the bank for updated statements under the guise of retirement planning. I scheduled a consultation with a financial advisor I'd worked with years ago, someone who knew me before I became Richard's wife. He listened without interrupting. Then he said something I won't forget. "Silence can be protection," he said, "but only if you decide when it ends." That night, Richard asked if everything was all right. I looked at him across the table, the man I had shared a life with. Holidays, losses, comfort. "Yes," I said truthfully. "I'm just thinking." He reached for my hand. I let him. Inside, I knew this wasn't about revenge. Not yet. It was about readiness. Because when you finally speak, after a long silence, every word has weight. And I was almost ready to speak. The moment came sooner than I expected. It wasn't dramatic. No raised voices, no slammed doors, just an ordinary Tuesday evening that cracked something open for good. Richard had stepped into the study to take a call, assuming I was distracted by the television. I turned the volume down just enough to hear him clearly. His voice was low-controlled and familiar in the way it had become over the years. He switched to Japanese. Not for long, just long enough. He spoke as if he were confirming details already decided, about timing, about moving funds before year's end, about keeping the household stable while things shifted quietly in the background. Then he laughed softly and said a sentence I will never forget. A sentence about how she trusts me completely. That word she hung in the air. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I let him finish the call. When he came back into the living room, he looked relaxed, unburdened, like a man who believed his world was still neatly arranged. "Everything okay?" he asked. "Yes," I said, "just tired." That night, sleep didn't come easily, but panic didn't come either. What I felt was something colder and steadier. Confirmation. The next morning, I drove to the bank in person. Not our usual branch, another one across town. I brought identification. I asked questions carefully. I learned what I could and noted what I couldn't. The clerk was polite, but cautious. "Some of these accounts are listed under your husband's sole authority," she explained. "I see," I said calmly. That answer mattered. Over the next few days, I reconstructed the shape of what Richard had been doing. Not stealing, not exactly, but positioning, preparing, making sure that if anything changed, illness, death, separation, he would remain comfortably ahead. And I would remain comfortable enough not to fight. That was the part that stung most. He wasn't trying to ruin me. He was trying to minimize me. I thought back to the dinner, the way he'd leaned in, confident I was excluded from the conversation. The way he'd chosen Japanese, not for politeness, but for privacy. He had never considered the possibility that I understood every word. One afternoon, while organizing old files, I found my passport from years ago. Stamps from Tokyo, Osaka, Yokohama. I remembered sitting in conference rooms, negotiating with men who underestimated me until the moment I spoke their language fluently. Their expressions then had been priceless. I felt something stir now. Not satisfaction. Not yet. Resolve. I made an appointment with an attorney recommended by my financial advisor. A woman my age. Direct. Experienced. She listened carefully as I explained everything, especially the language piece. "You're not imagining this," she said. "This is calculated behavior, and you were right not to confront him yet." "What should I do?" I asked. "Protect yourself first," she said. Then decide what outcome you want. That question followed me home. What outcome did I want? I didn't want humiliation. I didn't want destruction. I didn't want to scorch the earth just to prove I could. I wanted respect, and I wanted the truth acknowledged out loud. That evening, Richard mentioned another dinner coming up. Same client, same restaurant. You don't have to come if you don't want to, he said casually. I smiled. I'd love to. He looked surprised, then pleased. Great. I returned the smile. This time, it wasn't a mask. Because now I wasn't just listening. I was preparing. And the next time he spoke freely confident, I was frozen out. He would learn just how wrong that assumption had been. The second dinner felt different from the moment we walked in. Same restaurant, same lanterns, same polite bow from the host. But this time, I wasn't an observer drifting at the edge of the table. I was fully present, even as I kept my eyes lowered and my smile soft. Richard didn't notice the difference. That was the strange part. He was too comfortable in his assumptions to see the shift. The client arrived on time, greeting us warmly. Richard launched into conversation, switching between English and Japanese, with the ease of someone showing off a skill he believed belonged only to him. I listened. This time, the conversation went further, deeper, more detailed. They spoke about numbers, about restructuring, about shielding certain assets until things were finalized. Richard spoke carefully, but not carefully enough. He spoke like a man who believed the room was safe. I felt the weight of every word settle into place. When we left the restaurant, Richard was almost cheerful. He talked about the future with the confidence of someone who believed it was already secured. You were awfully quiet tonight, he said as we drove home. I enjoyed listening, I replied. He laughed. Business must sound like another language to you. I smiled into the darkness. Something like that. At home, I didn't go straight to bed. I sat at the kitchen table and opened my notebook. I wrote down everything I remembered. Phrases, timelines, numbers. I wasn't emotional about it. I was methodical. Over the next week, I revisited old conversations with new understanding. Every time Richard had brushed off my questions, every time he'd said, "Trust me," every time I'd accepted that as reassurance instead of deflection. Trust without information isn't trust, it's surrender. I pulled copies of tax filings, investment summaries, retirement projections. I noticed patterns, now transfers, that aligned with his travel accounts, that shifted after certain meetings. Nothing illegal, but intentional. I realized something important. Then, Richard wasn't planning to hurt me out of cruelty. He was acting out of fear. Fear of losing control. Fear of being vulnerable. Fear of having to explain himself. That didn't excuse it, but it explained the calmness with which he lied. One afternoon, I sat across from my attorney again. She reviewed my notes, nodded, asked clarifying questions. You have options, she said, but the most powerful one isn't legal. What is it, I asked. Timing, she replied. You choose when to reveal what you know. That word again, timing. I went home and watched Richard carefully. The way he relaxed when I didn't ask questions. The way he grew confident when silence continued. He mistook my calm for ignorance. I let him, not out of weakness, but because I wanted him to speak freely one last time. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. One evening, while reviewing paperwork at his desk, Richard sighed and said, "Once this deal settles, everything will be easier." For who, I asked lightly. For us, he said. Less uncertainty? I nodded. That's good. He leaned back in his chair. You know I appreciate how uncomplicated you are about these things. I looked at him then. Really looked. Uncomplicated, I asked. Yes, he said, smiling. You trust me. That means a lot. I held his gaze. It does. That night, I made my decision. I wasn't going to explode. I wasn't going to accuse. I wasn't going to unravel 22 years of marriage in one breath. I was going to let the truth surface naturally, because lies collapse fastest when they're forced into the light they were never meant to survive. I scheduled one more appointment with my attorney, one more with my advisor. I made sure my own accounts were secured. I documented everything. Then I waited, because the most powerful moment isn't when you discover the truth. It's when you decide how and when to use it. I didn't confront Richard right away. I let normal life continue. Grocery lists on the counter, laundry folded on Sundays, quiet evenings, watching old movies we'd both seen a dozen times. From the outside, nothing had changed. On the inside, everything had. There's a strange calm that comes when you stop wondering if something is wrong and start knowing what it is. That calm gave me patience. I began preparing not emotionally, but practically. I opened an account in my own name for the first time in years. I updated beneficiary information that had been temporary for far too long. I gathered documents I'd once trusted Richard to manage and made copies neat and labeled. I wasn't hiding anything. I was reclaiming it. One afternoon, I met my financial advisor again. He was gentle but direct. You're doing the right thing, he said. Many people wait too long. They hope the truth will change on its own. I'm not hoping anymore, I replied. He nodded. Good. Hope is not a plan. The words stayed with me. The moment of revelation came on an ordinary evening. No special setup. No dramatic timing. Richard was reviewing paperwork at the dining table, glasses perched low on his nose, humming to himself. I poured 2 cups of tea and sat across from him. Richard, I said calmly, there's something I need to ask you. He didn't look up. Sure. When did you start moving money without telling me? His pen stopped. Slowly, he looked up. What do you mean? I met his eyes. I mean the transfers, the restructuring, the accounts I'm not authorized to view. He frowned. That's business. No, I said evenly. That's our marriage. He leaned back, crossing his arms. You wouldn't understand the complexities. I took a breath. Try me. He hesitated. Just a second too long. That was when I spoke the sentence that changed everything. In Japanese, I said softly, you told your client, I trust you completely, and that I wouldn't notice. The room went very still. Richard stared at me as if I'd spoken from somewhere behind him. You, he began. I understood every word I said. At the dinner, on the phone, all of it. His face drained of color. How long? Long enough, I replied. For a moment, he said nothing. Then his shoulders sagged. I didn't think it mattered, he said quietly. That I replied is exactly the problem. He tried to explain. Fear, pressure, a desire to keep things stable. The words sounded rehearsed, now that I could hear them clearly. I listened without interrupting. When he finished, I said, you didn't trust me with the truth. You trusted me to stay silent. He looked at his hands. I didn't want to burden you. I carried a career across continents, I said. Don't confuse silence with fragility. That night, we talked for hours, not arguing, unraveling, naming things that had gone unnamed for years. He admitted what he'd done, not with drama, but with shame. I told him what I'd learned and what I'd protected. You underestimated me, I said, but I won't let that define us if you're willing to change. He nodded slowly. I am. I didn't forgive him that night. Forgiveness isn't a switch. But I did something just as powerful. I chose myself. The days after that conversation were quiet, but not empty. Richard didn't retreat into defensiveness the way I half expected. Instead, he became cautious, almost unsure of himself. He asked before making decisions. He showed me documents instead of summarizing them. He spoke more slowly, choosing words with care. Guilt does that to people when it's real. Still, trust doesn't return just because someone admits the truth. It returns through consistency and only over time. We met with my attorney together. That wasn't Richard's idea, it was mine. I needed to see how he behaved when accountability had witnesses. He was respectful. He listened. He answered questions directly. The attorney explained the legal reality in plain terms. Nothing Richard had done was criminal, but much of it had been deceptive, especially in a marriage built on shared life and shared risk. You made decisions for the household without consent, she said calmly. That has consequences. Richard nodded. I understand. The consequences were clear. Accounts were restructured with transparency. Access was shared. Future financial moves required mutual agreement. We revised our wills together, line by line, without rushing. It was uncomfortable. That mattered. At home, we talked differently, too. Slower, more honestly. We spoke about fear, his fear of losing control as he aged, my fear of being dismissed after a lifetime of competence. Those fears had been circling each other for years without touching. Now they finally met. I didn't want to feel replaceable, Richard admitted one evening, like I was just another old man hoping not to mess things up. And I didn't want to feel invisible, I replied. Like my experience stopped mattering once I stopped working. We sat with that truth between us. Not everything healed right away. There were awkward moments, defensive tones, silences that felt heavier than before. But this time, silence wasn't avoidance. It was processing. One night, Richard said something I hadn't expected. I thought speaking another language gave me an advantage, he said. I didn't realize it revealed my character. I nodded. Language doesn't create intent. It just exposes it. That was the turning point. Not because everything was fixed, but because responsibility had shifted from explanation to action. Months passed. Slowly trust reassembled, not the old kind built on assumption, but a new one built on visibility. We learned how to check in without suspicion, how to disagree without retreating, how to include each other instead of managing around each other. We didn't erase the damage. We integrated it. And in doing so, something unexpected happened. We became equals again. Not by default, by choice. What I learned from all of this didn't arrive in one clean lesson. It came in layers over months, in quiet moments that didn't feel dramatic at all. It came when I logged into an account without asking permission. When Richard paused before making a decision and said, "What do you think?" When silence no longer meant exclusion, but consideration. We didn't return to the marriage we had before that dinner. And honestly, I wouldn't want to. That marriage relied too heavily on assumptions, on roles we slipped into without questioning, on the idea that harmony meant one person leading quietly while the other followed just as quietly. What we have now is something sturdier. We are older. We move more slowly. We double-check things. We talk more than we used to. And sometimes those conversations are uncomfortable, but they are real. Richard still works. I still manage my own affairs. We share information not because we're required to, but because we've learned how damaging secrecy can be, especially when it hides behind the language of protection. I think often about that night in the restaurant, about how easily things could have gone differently. If I had laughed nervously and dismissed what I heard, if I had confronted him immediately, fueled by shock instead of clarity, if I had believed, even for a moment, that my understanding didn't matter. But I didn't. And that's the part I want to leave you with. If you're listening to this, and you're over 60, married, remarried, widowed, or navigating finances later in life, please hear this clearly. Never assume silence equals ignorance. Never assume age means irrelevance. And never let someone else decide what you are capable of understanding. Whether it's money, health, or family decisions, ask questions. Learn the language, whatever that language may be. Legal, financial, emotional, because the moment you understand what's really being said, you reclaim your place at the table. I stayed quiet when it protected me. I spoke up when it mattered. That balance, that timing, is not weakness, it's wisdom. If this story resonated with you, if it reminded you of a moment in your own life where listening changed everything, I invite you to reflect on it. Share it with someone who might need the reminder. And if you value stories that speak honestly about trust, dignity, and growing older with clarity rather than fear, I hope you'll stay with us and subscribe. Because it's never too late to be heard, and it's never too late to understand your own worth.